Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you today.
Happy Monday. Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. Before we get started, we want to talk about Blinken's Blinken trip.
Yeah,
to Kiev, because that certainly has caught our attention. But I just want to also mention that it looks like the military-industrial complex is doing their job right. They're lobbying like lobbyists are supposed to be. And here the White House will announce a new arms transfer to Ukraine this week.
All right.
You keep track of all this, don't you? Is this number 4? It's
another, at least, yeah.
It's another bunch of money, and I think they're up to about 3.4 billion now, and that's going to continue for a while, especially if our worries unfortunately come about, and that is that the war does not go away quickly, and it gets expanded, and the weapons will flow until everybody goes bankrupt or somebody takes over the world. So anyway, that'll be coming. But I want to talk first off about the trip with Blinken. You know, Blinken went there along with the Secretary of State and indicating that maybe they're concerned about what's happening, you know, over there, because most of the time these guys stay at home. But they're over there right now trying to figure it out, I guess. But I think it means nothing but more trouble. I mean, it may be a bad sign. I don't think it is, because some people are pretending that the Russians have been whipped, you know, this sort of thing. I don't think that is the case. But what they were doing there remains to be seen. But they were worried enough, I guess, to go make a visit.
Well, I think it was extraordinary, and I think the purpose it was meant to serve is to demonstrate very clearly to the world that the U.S. is buying in on this. The U.S. is fully committed. If you think about the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, two of the highest-ranking civilians in the U.S. government, apparently, from what we're told, physically went to Kiev, even though we've seen Russian rockets hitting Lvov, hitting elsewhere in western Ukraine. So if they did go, and some of the conspiracy theorists would say, well, there's no proof they were really there because they were in a bunker, who knows? But if they really did go there, it shows an extraordinary level of personal commitment among high-ranking U.S. government officials to show that we are with Ukraine 100%. It almost feels like a NATO commitment when you have these two high-ranking officials there. And we actually have, in the purpose of our subject as it is, we have a clip from Blinken after he gets there, and if we can cue that up and listen to it, it's only about 18 seconds, but it basically conveys the whole message that the U.S. wants to give the world as they travel to Ukraine. So if we have, here we go, let's listen to this whole 18 seconds.
In terms of Russia's war aims, Russia has already failed, and Ukraine has already succeeded, because the principal aim that President Putin brought to this, in his own words, was to fully subsume Ukraine back into Russia, to take away its sovereignty and independence. And that has not happened, and clearly will not happen.
It's a weird backdrop, but essentially, I mean, it sort of brings to mind, and someone else said this, not me, it kind of reminds you of that mission accomplished moment when President Bush was on the plane and he said, we did it, and the war dragged on. We don't know, but it certainly has a feel, maybe it's propaganda value, but he says Russia has already failed and Ukraine has already succeeded.
You wonder about them. You wonder where their minds are. Have they deceived themselves? What's the strategy? It doesn't seem to be good strategy. But what about a week or so ago, it was Biden and Harris. They were going to go. And that sort of blew the minds of a lot of people. So somebody, let that slip. But who knows? It might have been Biden himself, for all we know. But that was sort of squelched after a little bit. Yeah. But what they have in mind, it doesn't make much sense. And you have to assume everything that's on the surface, at least I do, everything on the surface and what they say here and do this is all part of the propaganda. But it seems like they're not good judgments of what they're doing, even though it's propaganda, and they do convince a lot of people of the need to be there. You know, there's still a lot of Americans think this is very important, you know, for us to be involved. But I just hope there's a growing number of people are waking up before another 19-year or 20-year war goes on, or a disaster like we had in the 60s and even in the 50s. It just goes on and on. I kept thinking that it would be a new era after the end of the Cold War, but my hopes have been sort of shattered by then. But I still hope there'll be enough people around to think about it. You know, there's just no sense in all this.
Well, the real danger isn't a 19-year war. The real danger is about a 20-minute war, which is what we're leaning towards.
That's true.
But let's look at a couple clips. Here is apparently Zelensky meeting with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, supposedly in Kiev, showing a huge level of solidarity. And the other thing that came out of this is Lloyd Austin from Raytheon, by the way, by way of the Secretary of Defense, he also says something, and we were there when he was there, and the New York Times picked up on it. And this signals a different strategy, because the strategy all along, if you remember, Dr. Paul, the mantra was, we're fighting for Ukraine's democracy. We're fighting for their values because they share our values. Well, let's go to that next clip from the New York Times, because they're singing a different tune now. New York Times, Monday, April 25th. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the U.S. wanted Russia to be weakened and unable to rebuild its military, a bolder American stance. So this is now saying what their real goal is, that the U.S. goal is to weaken Russia and make sure that Russia does not have the ability to very quickly reproduce its military capacity. That's a shift.
And you know, this has been verified by the president of Turkey. He comes up and said that Turkey's in NATO, but an independent-minded country right now, and said that some NATO members want prolonged. They want it on purpose.
Yeah.
And it's almost like there was one statement that said sacrificing some Ukrainians is not all that bad. You know, it was let them go in there and suffer. But what we need, our goal is, you know, to just weaken Russia. But you know, it's exactly opposite of what I believe and we sort of promote, and that is more friendship. And more trade, more dependence on each other. So what was the first thing that Biden does? They made sure that we'd interfere with Russia selling oil to Europe. You know,
Yeah.
and so that's NATO and Europe fighting, you know, Russia. And so it's back and forth, and there's really no honest diplomacy, no talks, no concern. There's no peace movement, it seems, on either side.
What's interesting about Zelensky is he shows such a sense of entitlement to our money. And this is a quote, we got it through antiwar.com. Well, here's Zelensky when he's telling us that, hey, Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, they're going to be here tomorrow. And look at this quote, if you can put this next one on. However, on Saturday, Zelensky stated that he expected high-level U.S. officials to visit Kiev and bring weapons. Quote, now listen to this. Talk about chutzpah. He says, you can't come to us empty-handed today. And we're expecting not just presents or some kind of cakes. We're expecting specific things and specific weapons. I mean, get a load of this guy. And, you know, the U.S. is responding. Let's put up that supplemental. This just came out, I think, in the Washington Post. Janet Yellen, she's been suiting up for this battle for a while. No, the supplemental, if we can. I know it's a pain, the bonus clip. But, and talk about, here's more chutzpah. Ukraine asked the U.S. for $2 billion a month in economic aid. So it's not enough that we sent them $4 billion in weapons and another few billion in economic aid. Now they basically want to go on the welfare rolls and have the American taxpayer dole out $2 billion a month.
There was a time in history, and there are still a few people around it, when you start talking about spending, you say, well, people have to earn this money, and it has to be taxed, and they take it and they pay it. But that doesn't even enter the equation, because you know, it's this management of the world reserve currency that permits the printing presses to run. So yes, we're capable of sending $2 billion. We can send $4 billion a month. It's endless. But what is not endless is the money really buying anything, and that's what we're in the beginning of, the destruction of the value of the dollar. So yes, it would cost us. But the goal is to make Russia suffer the most. But my immediate reaction, well, it was going to, you know, be a big cost to us, because it will be dollars and the people will suffer. It will cause more inflation here, precipitate more inflation. It would go on and on. But I think that's probably true, not just this example, but both sides seem to suffer, except maybe for the very, very wealthy. But sometimes the very, very wealthy and those who connive the most, the Nazi leaders didn't all get out of there in time, you know. So there's always a few. Most business people, arms manufacturers, they tend to protect themselves well enough against the inflation and all these other things. But ultimately, though, the masses suffer, the average middle class people, the people who have to fight the wars. So it's just a shame that the people just don't wake up and say, we don't need war.
Yeah.
We don't need it. It's not serving our purpose. We'd like to live in a free society. And it seems so logical to us. We just wonder why there aren't more people joining in.
Well, propaganda is a big reason why, you know. Let's put on this next one. This is from Anti-War, and you alluded to this in your opening, but I think it's worth restating. This is the clip from Anti-War here. White House will announce a new arms transfer to Ukraine this week. As you pointed out in the beginning, this is John Feiner. He's the Deputy National Security Advisor. We're going to have yet another weapons package this week. He told Meet the Press's Kirsten Welker, quote, "We've been announcing deliverables, which is a fancy word for things we are providing to the Ukrainians to enable their fight just about every day, and if not every day, every week. And we'll have a lot more to say about that in the week ahead." That all sounds fine. But on the other end, the Russians have already sent a letter warning, stop arming Ukraine. This is dangerous. And this is, put on that next clip, that's a tweet from Michael Tracy, who's always a very astute observer. And this is the point. This is coinciding with the visit, Dr. Paul, of the Secretaries of Defense and State. Michael Tracy points out, U.S. Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State enter Ukraine. Shortly thereafter, explosions at one of Russia's military logistics hubs, 100 miles inside Russian territory. Recall, the U.S. has bragged that it will now provide Ukraine with intel for offensive combat operations. This is very dangerous.
It's very stupid, you know, on the long run. On the short run, oh yeah, this is tough stuff. So this just gives the opening. It's another ratchet higher, because you know, this when we start, or NATO or whoever directs it, going into Russia and starts doing this, and now if the odds were equal. But I think Russia has a few nukes left over,
yeah.
and they don't hesitate to talk about it. I mean, just this week, Putin made the point. Don't they remember what we have in our arsenal? And so they're playing with not fire. They're playing with nuclear disaster,
yeah.
is what they are. And I think the sentiment, just as I remember it was, you know, back in the Cold War in the 50s, it's sort of reaching that atmosphere of people thinking, well, you know, I guess it could happen, and they just go on merrily on and pretend that there's no threat, but they keep ratcheting up the engagement and the misunderstanding. So I just think that both sides misinterpret what the opposition might do, and both of them react differently than they predict, and that's how these wars really build, and then control is lost.
And both Ukraine and Russia will tend to emphasize their gains and de-emphasize their losses. That's just a matter of using, you know, propaganda. So
Yeah.
you'll see a lot about the Russian successes without seeing a lot of the blown up things, and the same with Ukraine. The fact of the matter is, though, the U.S. administration said over the weekend that Mariupol is not in Russian hands. Well, that's really not the case. It is, and there was some video from church services there for the first time in Mariupol. They've also said, Zelensky said he's going to take back Crimea, which is kind of hard to pass the laugh factor, because the reality is when you look at maps that are put out by both sides, including the Neocon Institute for the Study of War and the pro-Russia and the pro-Ukraine, as we've talked about, as Scott Ritter talked about on Thursday, you see the vast majority of Ukraine's army about to be encircled in in Donbass area. So it's really hard to come up with the conclusion that you're about to retake Crimea or maybe Moscow when you have most of your military surrounded. Now, maybe if you've got an amazing plan to break out of it, but the fact of the matter is there's a lot of propaganda on both sides.
There's no doubt about it, and they live with that. They do it in a preliminary way, and we've watched that for years, especially in this century. The Middle East, the buildup in the Middle East was constantly propaganda, even with HW. It wasn't just Bush. HW Bush was doing the W. Bush. It was HW Bush started it too.
Yeah.
For the and that tragic ending was piles. The stupidity of all that, and I don't know what drives them, where their moral, how they lose their moral bearing.
Yeah.
But peace does not seem to be on the top of the list of seeking peace.
Not on their agenda.
It's just sort of sad. They won't even allow people to have athletic functions. That is so disgusting.
Yeah.
Of punishing the athletes because of politics, and there's an answer that you can have trade. You mean to say that Germany is going to buy gas and oil, from Russia, and Russia could supply and take care of all of Europe? Oh no, we don't want that. That's too simple. We want to discipline the people and go on with it.
Well, the other fallout here is that NATO is looking to Finland and Sweden as potential new members. And you can put up that tweet. Actually, I think you're going to have to skip one clip and put up that Zero Hedge tweet, because this will sort of highlight what we're talking about. Finland will likely submit application for NATO membership in coming weeks. I believe the individual on the right is the defense minister for Finland. So they announced they've had a history of being neutral, Sweden and Ukraine, even through World War II. But now apparently they wish to have NATO membership and to have the Article 5 protection that we will go to war if anything happens to them.
You wonder whether it's the pressure from the West and NATO that makes it happen, or they're truly frightened. But can you think about, the onslaught of the Nazis and the communists to World War II, and they still didn't capitulate. In Sweden, we were always told in school and all, Switzerland and Sweden, they're neutral. They weren't totally neutral, but they were neutral, and they didn't march their kids off, and it was amazing. They always had to have an exchange post. Both sides, I understand, like exchange posts.
Yeah.
So, but no, Finland says they will likely submit the application, and that will, once Finland does that, then Sweden said they'll do it too.
Yeah.
And that's just, more obligations for the American taxpayers. It's I think Pat Buchanan wrote a good article about what this sets it up for. The littlest, not the littlest, but any significant attack on them, a border dispute or something, then we have this obligation. Of course, we see it as a stupid obligation. Other people say, if we see this as an opportunity, we'll have to send more weapons and all there. But it's a real sad state of affairs. So right now, I guess so far today, we're talking about more escalation, or the threat of escalation, and yet we don't have anybody on our side really talking peace, and I don't think that many people are going to listen to the peace movement in Russia. I'm sure there's a peace movement in Russia, because that's a dangerous thing to do. But this is aggravation. This really always pushes me back to the end of World War II and Robert Taft. Stay out of it.
Yeah.
But the founders argued that too. Stay out of Europe, especially Europe. But stay out of the. If you ever wanted to find an entangling alliance, look at what NATO is, and it gets worse all the time. The only good thing that could come about for this, it will totally bankrupt this country, and we'll have to quit using our printing presses to fight stupid wars.
Yeah. Well, the foolishness of this whole thing, Russia says to the U.S., look, we don't want missiles on our border. The U.S. says, who cares? We'll do it anyway. Russia invades Ukraine. So what does the U.S. and NATO do? They say, oh, well, let's bring in Finland with 1,000 miles of borders with Russia, and let's put some missiles there. Yeah. I mean, this is really stupidity, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different answer. And it's not to excuse, but we would be the same way if a hostile China or if ISIS started putting missiles on the border with Mexico. That's the exact same way we'd feel.
You can talk about bleeding. Do you think the Russians will have a better opportunity to bleed us when these borders, because there was this legitimacy of what was going on with Ukraine and Russia and their history and all that was a lot different. But now you add more of these countries in these huge borders, whether it's China or Russia. I mean, it won't take much to bleed us. I mean, we're already more bled than most people admit that we are, and things are out of control.
Well, you mentioned Pat Buchanan. There is a great quote. This is an article we published last week, I think it was, if we can put on that next clip, the second to last clip, and it's a long one, but a couple of good points that he makes as usual. Why is it wise for us to formally agree in perpetuity, as NATO is a permanent alliance, to go to war with Russia for Finland? Given the war in Ukraine and concomitant crisis in Eastern Europe, it's understandable why Stockholm and Helsinki would seek greater security beneath the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And here's a great point. But why should we voluntarily agree to give Sweden and Finland these war guarantees? Why would we commit to go to war with Putin's Russia, a war that could and likely would escalate to the use of tactical nuclear weapons, especially if Russia were losing? And he finalizes this quote, Finland was neutral during the Cold War. Sweden has been neutral since the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. How did we suffer from their neutrality? Good point.
Absolutely, and it looks like it's going to end. It looks like Sweden will capitulate and go along with them. So that to me is a sad story, and all I can say is we will continue to do our best to get the information. And I think not only the information, it's the biggest job now. There's a lot of information. It's which side are you going to believe?
Yeah.
But that's been an eternal problem. But and it's more difficult when they're leading up to war. There is a war going on, because the saying is that that's the first sacrifice, is the telling the truth. But governments now, especially our government, I think is probably at the bottom it's ever been. Because even though there's been a lot of fibbing going on from the very beginning, I would think the lying now, when you think of our Justice Department and our Defense Department and our CIA and all this activity, and it is pretty hard for people to keep up with it all, and it's much easier to say, well, I'd like to just forget about it, and I don't fault people like that, because if that was their biggest fault, that they just want to forget about it and they don't want to engage, let the other people do the discussion and let them work it out on how countries should get together. And there's a few examples in the world where countries have lived beside each other and war never broke out.
Yeah. Well, you're right. You say everyone's asking, well, which side are you on? Russia's side, Ukraine's side? Unfortunately, there are a few of us who are on America's side, right?
Yeah.
What's in it for us? What should we be doing? Well, I'm going to close, Dr. Paul, with a reminder. This is Monday morning. If you can put up that final clip. Just over a month away, our conference in Houston, The Biden Doctrine, New World Order or Nuclear Armageddon. I'm pleased to report that over 8 out of 10 available tickets have been sold. We're actually going to have to contact the venue and see if we can get a little bit more space, because we don't want to have to turn people away if we can avoid it. So get your tickets. Go to ronpaulinstitute.org. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner of our website a link to where you can click on and check it out. It's going to be a great event. We announced last week that Scott Ritter is going to be there. That show was huge. We had Scott on Thursday. It was huge. So people obviously want to see Scott speak. We'll announce a couple more speakers here in the next couple of days, but we're going to have a great event. It's reasonably priced for a full breakfast and a big group of speakers. So we hope that you'll join us in Houston, June 4th, ronpaulinstitute.org, and I'll also put a link in the description.
Very good. Very good. And I hope to see a lot of you at that little meeting we're having there, and look forward to that. But a lot of people are seeking information, and it's difficult to sort it all out. It's difficult for me to make sure I read this, I read that. My instinct says one thing, and then you wonder about the other. But that I think is something that goes on in life all the time. But most of the time, people don't really care. Whatever they want to believe, they believe. But when it gets into war and peace, it makes a big difference. You know, if they believe one way or the other. But the people that really scare me the most are the ones who aren't even seeking anything. They've already made up their mind, and they've decided, well, why even bother doing this? Because finding truth is impossible. They're nihilists, you know. And this is so much of the philosophy of the authoritarians, whether they're fascists or communists or whatever. You can't know the truth, so we'll establish the truth. So the Soviet system and a radical communist and a fascist, that is the case. But just think of how many people now are participating in the various groups in this country. So I think so often it boils down to a moral issue, because I do believe that if you look at it and look at the whole picture, the type of government a country has is a reflection of what the prevailing attitude of the people. When you have a prevailing attitude, say, of Christian morality, you have a different government. And certainly there was a moral principle based on what the founders were doing. So yes, we can come up with perfect foreign policy decisions and say, do this, buy this weapon, do this, and talk about military process. But ultimately, the people have to decide they want to live in a free country, understand what freedom is, and how many tremendous benefits can come from it. So we will continue to pursue those goals. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.